Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Phantom Footsteps. Sarah had been working late again, the clock on her computer screen flashing 11:45 p.m. She was the only one left in the office, as usual. The building was empty, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound that filled the quiet air. It wasn't uncommon for her to stay late, catching up on reports and paperwork that piled up during the day. But tonight, something felt different. She sat in front of her desk, the glow of her screen illuminating the dim room, when she heard it. Soft, faint footsteps. They echoed down the hallway, almost like they were coming closer. At first, Sarah assumed it was just a coworker or maybe even the janitor. But as she glanced up, her heart skipped a beat. The office was eerily silent. No one was around. The footsteps continued. Slow, measured. They grew louder, closer, each step ringing in her ears. A wave of unease washed over her. She wasn't alone. She couldn't be. Panic began to creep up her spine as she got up from her desk. She walked hesitantly toward the hallway, peering into the darkness, but there was nothing there. No one, just empty, deserted offices with the occasional flicker of a light. She stood still for a moment. The only sound now was the rapid beat of her heart. And then the footsteps stopped. A breath of cold air passed through her, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Just as she turned to head back to her desk, the lights overhead flickered. Once, twice. Then they went completely dark for a split second. When they came back on, the shadows stretched across the room like dark fingers grasping at the walls. The air turned colder, and Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Something was wrong. Something was here. That's when it happened. The footsteps, now unmistakable, were right behind her. She spun around, her body tensing in fear. But there was nothing, no one, just the emptiness of the office, silent and still. The footsteps had stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving Sarah in the suffocating quiet of the room. The chill that had settled in her bones was only growing colder. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed her bag, stuffed her papers into her purse, and rushed to the door. She locked up, her hands shaking as she twisted the key in the lock. Without another thought, she darted for the elevator. She pressed the button repeatedly, as if willing it to come faster. When the doors finally opened, she stepped inside, breathing a little easier. The ride down was agonizingly slow. Every floor passed by, and Sarah's mind replayed the footsteps over and over again. The sound was still fresh in her ears, echoing through her head. Was it just her imagination? Or was there something else in that building? Something not quite right. When the elevator finally reached the ground floor, Sarah rushed out, her heart pounding, and headed straight for the exit. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of the silence that followed her seemed almost worse than the fear itself. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something behind her. But there was nothing, just the quiet streets of the downtown area and the distant hum of traffic. Sarah paused for a moment, taking in a deep breath of relief. She had made it out. But the footsteps, those phantom footsteps, never really left her. They echoed in her mind, lingering long after she had stepped into her car and driven away. Even now, they still followed her, and she knew, deep down, that the next time she stayed late at the office, she might not be alone again. Story 2. The Shadow in the Security Room. Mark was just getting used to his new job at the old abandoned mall. The hours were long, and the place was eerie, but it paid well, and he needed the money. His role was simple: patrol the building every hour, make sure nothing was out of place, and keep an eye on the security cameras. The mall had been closed for years, and most of the stores were boarded up. The lights flickered in certain spots, and the air smelled musty. Still, Mark had heard worse stories from other security guards. It was just a job, nothing special. The first few hours passed without incident. Mark wandered the dark hallways, his footsteps echoing in the silence, but everything seemed fine. He made his way back to the security room around midnight, ready to watch the monitors. That's when he noticed something. In one corner of the security footage, something moved. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't a reflection. It was just a shadow, a shape that seemed to shift, stretching across the wall, though no one was there. Mark frowned. He thought it could be a glitch, but the longer he stared at it, the more real it felt. The shadow crept across the screen, slowly inching closer to the desk where Mark sat, just out of the frame. His heart skipped a beat. He stood up and rushed out of the room, checking the hallway, but saw nothing. The air felt cold, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He quickly glanced back at the monitor. The shadow was still there. It was moving closer, slowly, as if it had all the time in the world. Mark's hands trembled as he double-checked every corner of the mall. Nothing. The place was empty, and the silence was overwhelming. He even stepped outside to catch his breath, convinced he was just seeing things. When he came back inside, the shadow was gone. Relieved, he sat down at the desk. He exhaled deeply, trying to calm his nerves. But then, something worse happened. The screen went fuzzy, static flickering across the monitor. For a few seconds, the image was a blurry mess of black and white. Mark rubbed his eyes, unsure if he was seeing things. And then, a whisper came through the speakers. Soft, faint, but clear. Leave. Mark froze, his body turning to stone. His stomach dropped, and his hands gripped the edge of the desk. The voice wasn't a glitch, it was real. Mark stood up, trembling. He looked around the room, half expecting someone to jump out of the darkness. But there was nothing, just the empty walls of the old mall. His feet moved before his brain could process what was happening. He ran out of the security room and didn't stop until he was in his car, far away from the mall. Mark never went back, and whenever he passed that old mall, he couldn't help but feel the cold, creeping sensation that something or someone was still waiting inside, watching. He had been warned. Story 3. The Disembodied Voice. It was Lucy's first night working the graveyard shift at the old rural hospital. The building had an eerie vibe, with long, dark hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. Most of the patients were deep in sleep. The only sounds breaking the silence were the soft beeps of heart monitors and the low hum of the ventilation system. The air felt heavy, like the hospital itself was holding its breath. At 3 a.m., Lucy made her way down the dimly lit hallway, checking on the rooms as part of her rounds. The quiet was unnerving, every step echoing off the cracked walls. As she walked past room 212, a sudden, faint whisper caught her off guard. "Lucy!" She stopped, her heart skipping a beat. She looked around. No one was there. The hallway was as empty as it had been a moment ago. Thinking it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, Lucy shook it off and continued on her rounds, trying to ignore the unease creeping up her spine. But when she reached the end of the hall and turned back to make her way to the nurse's station, she passed room 212 again. This time, the voice was louder, clearer, almost desperate. "Lucy, help me." Chills ran down her arms. She felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. Lucy hesitated, but decided to check the room, convinced it was just another patient calling out in her sleep. She pushed the door open, but when she stepped inside, she froze. The patient in the bed was still, completely asleep, breathing softly. There was no one else in the room, but something was wrong. Lucy's eyes wandered around the room, her gaze landing on the window. It was slightly ajar, just enough for a cold draft to creep in. She could have sworn the window had been closed when she did her last round. A knot tightened in her stomach. She stepped closer to the window, peering outside into the dark night. That's when she felt it. A cold breeze brushed against the back of her neck, as if someone had just stood right behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The room was still, silent. Then the voice came again. This time, it was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Leave." The air in the room seemed to freeze, and Lucy's heart pounded in her chest. Her breath came out in short, sharp gasps. She didn't hesitate. She turned and ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands were shaking as she locked the door, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting. That night, Lucy finished her rounds quickly, locking every door, turning off every light. When her shift ended, she couldn't leave fast enough. From that night on, she never stayed past midnight during her shifts. And no matter how hard she tried to forget, she could never shake the feeling that room 212 was waiting for her return.